You're too confused to handle your own affairs, Mom. That's what my daughter Debbie said to the judge while I sat in what I thought was a routine doctor's appointment. Except it wasn't a doctor's office. It was a courtroom, and they were trying to declare me incompetent so they could control my money. I had walked into my own legal execution. The betrayal hit me like ice water in my veins, but I kept my face perfectly still. 71 years of living had taught me that sometimes the best response is no response at all. At least not until you understand exactly what battlefield you're standing on. And as I sat there listening to my own flesh and blood describe me as a doddering old woman who couldn't remember her own name, I realized I was in the fight of my life. Let me tell you how I got there, because the story doesn't start in that courtroom. It starts 8 months earlier when my son-in-law Tim first suggested I might be getting a little forgetful. Not directly, of course. Tim was far too clever for that kind of obvious manipulation. It came wrapped in concern, delivered with that patronizing smile he'd perfected over the years. I had been living peacefully in the same house for 47 years, the house my late husband Smart and I bought when Debbie was just 5 years old. Smart had been gone for 4 years now, and I had settled into a comfortable routine of managing my own affairs, tending my extensive garden, volunteering at the local library, and occasionally babysitting my granddaughter Rachel when Debbie would allow it, which, I had noticed with growing concern, was becoming less and less frequent. The house was mine, free and clear. Smart had been a methodical man, a certified public accountant who understood the importance of documentation, planning, and leaving no financial stone unturned. When he passed, he left me well provided for, not just with the house, but with a substantial life insurance policy, retirement accounts that had been carefully managed for decades, and a diversified investment portfolio that had grown quite impressively over the years. I wasn't wealthy by anyone's standards, but I was more than comfortable, you say. I had enough to live independently for the rest of my life, travel if I wanted to, help with Rachel's college education, and still leave something meaningful to Debbie and her family. But Tim had always had expensive tastes, and more importantly, expensive habits. I watched him over the years, always pushing Debbie to buy bigger houses, fancier cars, take more elaborate vacations than their dual-income household could realistically support. He worked in real estate development, a field that provided good money during boom times, but was notoriously unstable during economic downturns. Debbie worked as a nurse at the local hospital, steady employment that provided good benefits, but certainly not enough to support the lifestyle Tim seemed determined to maintain. Over the years, I had noticed their spending patterns with the kind of quiet concern that mothers develop when they watch their adult children making questionable financial decisions. The luxury SUV that came with payments higher than my monthly grocery budget. The kitchen renovation that cost more than I had spent on my entire house. The annual vacation to Europe that required them to borrow money from their home equity line of credit. But I had learned long ago that unsolicited financial advice from parents rarely improves family relationships, so I kept my observations to myself and simply made mental notes about their apparent inability to live within their means. The first real warning sign came during our monthly family dinner, a tradition I had maintained since Smart's death, as a way to stay connected with my daughter and granddaughter. We were sitting in my dining room, the same dining room where I had served thousands of family meals over the decades, when Tim casually mentioned that I seemed to be slowing down a bit. "What do you mean?" I asked, genuinely curious about his observation. "Oh, you know," he said, cutting into the pot roast I'd spent the afternoon preparing. "Just little things. Like last week when you forgot that we had changed the dinner time from 6 to 7. I stared at him, completely baffled. "Tim, we never changed the dinner time. It's been 6 o'clock every third Sunday for the past 4 years. He exchanged a quick glance with Debbie, and I caught something in that look that made my skin prickle with unease. It was the kind of look people share when they're discussing a problem that the subject of their discussion isn't supposed to understand. Like, "Mom," Debbie said gently, "don't you remember? I called you last Tuesday and told you we needed to push dinner back an hour because Rachel had a soccer game." I knew with absolute certainty that no such conversation had ever taken place. I kept a detailed calendar, the same system I had used for decades to manage household schedules, appointments, and social obligations. There was no notation about any schedule change, and more importantly, I remembered our last conversation clearly. We had discussed Rachel's upcoming science fair project and Debbie's concerns about staffing shortages at the hospital. There had been no mention of soccer games or schedule changes, but arguing the point would only make me sound defensive, possibly confused. So I simply nodded and said, I must have misunderstood. The second warning sign came 3 weeks later when I noticed that items in my house were being moved around during Debbie and Tim's visits. Nothing dramatic or obvious, just small changes that could easily be attributed to normal tidying up or helpfulness. My reading glasses moved from their usual spot on the kitchen counter to the coffee table. Important mail relocated from my desk to a pile on the dining room table. The spare house key moved from its designated hook to a different location entirely. Each incident was minor enough to dismiss as coincidence or simple helpfulness, but together they formed a pattern that made me increasingly uncomfortable. When I mentioned that I couldn't find my glasses in their usual spot, Tim would look concerned and suggest that maybe I should consider keeping them in just one place so I wouldn't forget where they were. When I couldn't locate an important piece of mail, Debbie would find it in a safer location and gently suggest that perhaps I should let them help me organize my paperwork. They were creating small problems and then positioning themselves as the solution to those problems. The third warning sign was when I discovered that Tim had been asking detailed questions about my finances during conversations with my neighbors. My next-door neighbor Agnes mentioned it almost casually during one of our regular morning coffee visits. "That son-in-law of yours certainly is thorough," Agnes said, stirring cream into her coffee. "He was asking me the other day about whether I had noticed any changes in your behavior, whether you seemed confused about money matters, that sort of thing." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "What did you tell him?" "Well, I told him the truth, of course. That you're sharp as a tack and handle your affairs better than most people half your age." Agnes paused, studying my face. "Audrey, is everything all right?" The way he was asking questions, it almost sounded like he was building some kind of case. Building a case. The phrase echoed in my mind long after Agnes had returned to her own house. That evening, I did something I hadn't done since Smart's death. I called our old family attorney, Dave Morrison. Dave had handled our wills, our estate planning, and various legal matters for nearly 20 years. He was semi-retired now, but he still maintained a small practice handling estate and elder law matters. "Audrey," Dave said, his voice warm with genuine pleasure. "How are you doing?" "I've been thinking about you and wondering how you're managing." "Dave, I need some advice and maybe some help. I think my family might be planning something and I'm not sure what to do about it." I told him everything. The small incidents, the moved items, Tim's questions to neighbors, the strange conversations about my supposed forgetfulness. Dave listened without interrupting, occasionally asking clarifying questions, taking notes in that methodical way that had always made me feel confident in his professional judgment. When I finished, there was a long pause. "Audrey," Dave said finally, "what you're describing sounds like the early stages of what we call preparation for undue influence. It's more common than people realize, and unfortunately, family members are often the perpetrators." "What does that mean exactly?" "It means someone is laying the groundwork to claim that you're no longer competent to manage your own affairs. They create evidence of confusion, forgetfulness, poor judgment. Then they use that evidence to justify taking control of your finances, supposedly for your own protection." The words hit me like a physical blow. Can they do that? They can try. But Audrey, the fact that you've recognized the pattern and you're calling me about it tells me that you're far from incompetent. We need to take some protective steps, and we need to take them soon. The next morning, I made an appointment with my physician, Dr. Rachel Hendricks. Dr. Hendricks had been my doctor for 8 years, ever since my previous physician retired. She was a woman in her early 50s, thorough and direct, with the kind of no-nonsense manner that I appreciated in medical professionals. "Mrs. Patterson," she said after I had explained my concerns, "I want to order a comprehensive cognitive assessment. Not because I have any concerns about your mental function, but because I want you to have official documentation of your cognitive status." Is that really necessary? In this situation, yes. If your family is questioning your competency, you need medical evidence to refute their claims. The assessment will test memory, reasoning, judgment, and decision-making abilities. Based on my observations during our appointments over the years, I expect you'll perform very well. The cognitive assessment was scheduled for the following week, and I spent the intervening days paying closer attention to every interaction with Debbie and Tim. What I observed was both subtle and deeply disturbing. They had developed a systematic approach to undermining my confidence in my own perceptions. During visits, they would reference conversations that had never happened, then express concern when I couldn't remember them. They would ask me the same questions multiple times during a single visit, then suggest that I had forgotten we had already discussed the topic. They would move items around my house, then act worried when I couldn't find things in their usual locations. It was gaslighting. pure and simple, and it was working, at least to the extent that anyone observing our interactions might genuinely believe I was becoming confused or forgetful. But I had one significant advantage that they didn't know about. Smart hadn't just been a meticulous accountant. He had also served as a volunteer tax preparer for elderly clients through the AARP program. Over the years, he had shared numerous stories about financial elder abuse, the warning signs to watch for, and the methods that perpetrators typically use to gain control of their victims' assets. Those dinner table conversations, which I had found mildly interesting at the time, were now proving invaluable. The cognitive assessment went exactly as Dr. Hendricks had predicted. I scored well above average in every category: memory, reasoning, judgment, mathematical skills, language comprehension. Every measure of cognitive function fell within the normal range for my age group, and most fell significantly above average. Mrs. Patterson, Dr. Hendricks said as we reviewed the results, "Your cognitive function is excellent. There are no signs of dementia, cognitive impairment, or any condition that would affect your ability to make sound decisions about your personal or financial affairs. What about the concerns my family has raised?" Dr. Hendricks frowned slightly. "Based on these results and my observations during our appointments, I would say their concerns are unfounded. In fact, I would be interested to know what specific behaviors they've observed that led them to question your competency." Armed with Dr. Hendricks's assessment, I felt more confident about my situation, but I also realized that the assessment was only the beginning of what I needed to do to protect myself. If Debbie and Tim were planning to challenge my competency, I needed to be prepared for a much more serious legal battle. That evening, I made a decision that would prove to be crucial. I called Dave Morrison and asked him to recommend a private investigator. "Audrey, are you sure you want to go down that road? Once you start investigating your own family—" "Dave, they've already decided I'm an obstacle to be removed. I'm just leveling the playing field." The private investigator Dave recommended was a woman named Sarah Chen, a former police detective who now specialized in financial crimes and elder abuse cases. Sarah was in her 40s with short black hair and the kind of direct professional manner that immediately put me at ease. "Mrs. Patterson," Sarah said during our initial meeting, "I want you to understand that investigating family members can reveal things you might not want to know. Are you prepared for that possibility?" "I'm prepared for the truth, whatever it might be." What Sarah discovered over the next 2 weeks was far worse than I had imagined. Debbie and Tim were not just living beyond their means, they were drowning in debt. Credit cards maxed out to their limits, a second mortgage on their house, car loans that exceeded the value of the vehicles, and a home equity line of credit that was approaching its maximum. Their total debt exceeded $200,000, not including their primary mortgage. But the most damning discovery was a series of financial consultations Tim had been having with estate planning attorneys. Not just one consultation, but multiple meetings with different lawyers, asking detailed questions about guardianship proceedings, conservatorship laws, and the process for having someone declared legally incompetent. Sarah also uncovered evidence that Tim had been researching my financial situation far more thoroughly than I had realized. He had contacted my bank, my investment advisor, and my insurance company, claiming to be my son-in-law and expressing concern about my ability to manage my affairs. While none of these institutions had provided him with specific account information, they had confirmed the existence of the accounts and generally discussed the types of services I used. "Mrs. Patterson," Sarah said as she presented her findings, "in my professional opinion, your daughter and son-in-law are planning to have you declared incompetent so they can gain control of your assets. They're not just hoping for an inheritance someday. They need your money now to solve their immediate financial problems." The realization hit me like a tsunami. My own daughter, the child I had raised, nurtured, and supported through every challenge of her life, was actively planning to betray me in the most fundamental way possible. But I didn't have time to process the emotional impact of this discovery because Sarah had more information to share. "There's something else," Sarah said. "Tim has been in contact with a guardianship attorney who specializes in what the legal community calls emergency conservatorships. These are cases where families claim there's an immediate crisis requiring urgent intervention to protect an elderly person's assets." "What kind of crisis?" "Usually something that suggests the person is making dangerous or irrational financial decisions. Large withdrawals, unusual purchases, susceptibility to scams, the kind of behavior that would justify immediate court intervention." A chill ran down my spine. "Are they planning to create that kind of crisis?" "Based on the pattern of their behavior so far, I think that's exactly what they're planning. That night, I sat in my kitchen until nearly dawn, trying to understand how my life had reached this point. How had the daughter I loved become someone who could plot against me so methodically? How had I failed to see the signs of their financial desperation? How had I been so naive about their true motivations for their increased attention and concern? But by morning, I had moved past the emotional devastation and into a state of cold, determined clarity. If Debbie and Tim wanted a war, they would have one. But it would be fought on my terms, with my rules, and I would be the one who decided how it ended. The first step was to secure my financial assets. I met with my bank manager and my investment advisor, informing them that no one except me was authorized to access my accounts or receive information about my finances. I updated all of my passwords and security questions, and I arranged for all communications about my accounts to be sent to a post office box that only I controlled. The second step was to update all of my legal documents. Dave Morrison prepared new power of attorney documents, healthcare directives, and a revised will. The power of attorney specifically excluded Debbie and Tim unless I was declared incompetent by 2 independent physicians, and even then, it appointed Dave as the primary agent with authority to make financial decisions. The new will included specific language about what would happen if anyone challenged my mental capacity or attempted to gain unauthorized control of my assets. The third step was to establish a network of witnesses who could testify to my competency if necessary. Agnes was an obvious choice, but I also recruited my librarian colleagues, my doctor, my bank manager, and several other people who interacted with me regularly and could speak to my mental acuity and judgment. But the most important step was preparing for the confrontation I knew was coming. It came sooner than I expected. 2 weeks later, Debbie called to invite me to lunch at a restaurant I had never heard of in a part of town I rarely visited. When I asked about the location, she explained that Tim had suggested it because it was quiet and private, where we could talk about some important family matters. The restaurant was exactly what I had expected. Upscale but not memorable. The kind of place where serious conversations could be held without attracting attention. Debbie and Tim were already seated when I arrived, and I noticed immediately that they had chosen a corner booth that offered privacy from other diners. "Mom," Debbie said, standing to hug me, "you look wonderful." "How are you feeling?" It was a loaded question, designed to elicit information about my health and mental state. I answered carefully, describing my activities, my routines, my general sense of well-being. I could see them listening intently, cataloging my responses for future use. We ordered lunch and made small talk for the first few minutes, but I could sense the tension building toward whatever agenda they had planned for this meeting. Finally, Tim cleared his throat and leaned forward with that concerned expression I had come to recognize and distrust. "Audrey," he said, "Debbie and I have been talking and we're worried about you." "What kind of worries?" "Well," Debbie said, "we've noticed some changes lately. Small things, but they add up. Like forgetting conversations we've had, or having trouble finding things around the house, or seeming confused about schedules and appointments." Every word was a lie, but delivered with such convincing sincerity that I found myself almost questioning my own memories. "I haven't noticed any problems," I said carefully. "That's actually part of what concerns us," Tim said. "People with early-stage cognitive decline often don't recognize the symptoms themselves. It's very common for family members to notice changes before the person experiencing them does. They had obviously done their research, learning the language and concepts that would support their narrative of my supposed decline. We think it might be a good idea for you to have a complete medical evaluation," Debbie continued, "just to establish a baseline and make sure everything is okay. I had a physical 3 months ago. Dr. Hendricks said I was in excellent health. We're thinking more of a specialist," Tim said, "someone who focuses specifically on age-related cognitive issues. We've actually found someone who comes highly recommended. They had already found a doctor, someone who would presumably be more willing to find problems than Dr. Hendricks had been. And we've been thinking," Debbie said, "that it might be time to talk about some practical matters. You know, making sure you have help with the more complicated aspects of managing your affairs." There it was, the real purpose of this lunch. What kinds of help? Tim pulled a folder from his briefcase and placed it on the table between us. "We've had some documents prepared. Nothing major, just some basic powers of attorney that would let us help you with financial decisions if you ever need it." I opened the folder and scanned the documents quickly. They were comprehensive powers of attorney that would give Debbie and Tim complete control over my finances, my property, and virtually every aspect of my legal affairs. Moreover, they were designed to take effect immediately upon signing, not just in the event of my incapacity. These seem quite extensive, I said. Well, we want to make sure we can help you with anything that comes up, Debbie explained. You know, paying bills, managing investments, handling insurance matters, all the complicated paperwork that gets harder to deal with as we get older. And if you ever need to move to a care facility, Tim added, we'd be able to handle selling the house and making sure your money is properly managed to pay for your care. They were already planning to sell my house. I closed the folder and placed it back on the table. This is very thoughtful, but I'm not ready to sign anything today. I'd like to have my attorney review these documents first. The temperature at the table dropped several degrees. Debbie's smile became strained. Mom, I don't think you need an attorney for something like this. These are just standard family planning documents. Nevertheless, I'd prefer to have Dave look them over. Tim's expression hardened slightly. Audrey, I have to ask, why are you being so resistant to accepting help from your own family? It was a trap, designed to make me seem paranoid or unreasonable, but I had been expecting it. I'm not resistant to help, I said calmly. I'm just careful about legal documents. Smart always taught me to never sign anything without understanding exactly what it means. But you trust us, don't you? Debbie asked, and there was something almost desperate in her voice. Of course I trust you, I lied. That's exactly why I want to make sure everything is done properly. The lunch ended awkwardly, with Debbie and Tim clearly frustrated by my refusal to sign their documents, and me increasingly certain that I was right to be suspicious of their motives. That evening I called Sarah Chen. Sarah, I think things are about to escalate. They've prepared power of attorney documents and they're pressuring me to sign them. Just when I refused, they seemed genuinely upset. That's concerning, Mrs. Patterson. People planning a legitimate intervention don't typically get angry when someone wants to consult their attorney first. What do you think they'll do next? Based on the pattern we've established, I think they'll try to create some kind of crisis that would justify immediate intervention. You need to be very careful about any unusual situations or emergencies they might present to you. I didn't have to wait long to find out what she meant. 3 days later, Debbie called me in obvious distress. Mom, something terrible has happened. Tim's been in an accident. My first instinct was genuine concern, despite everything that had been happening. Is he all right? What kind of accident? He's in the hospital. It's pretty serious. Mom, I need your help. Of course. What can I do? The insurance situation is complicated, and there are some immediate medical bills that need to be paid. I hate to ask, but could you help us with some of the costs? It would just be temporary until the insurance gets sorted out. Everything about the conversation felt wrong. Debbie was obviously upset, but there was something rehearsed about her distress, something that didn't quite ring true. How much are we talking about? I asked. About $30,000. I know it's a lot, but Mom, I don't know what else to do. The hospital is saying they need payment for some of the procedures, and our insurance is being difficult about pre-authorization. $30,000. A significant amount, but not enough to solve their overall financial problems. This felt like a test, a way to establish a pattern of me providing large sums of money for emergencies. Debbie, I want to help, but that's a substantial amount. I'd need to transfer money from my investment accounts, and my advisor always recommends getting documentation for large medical expenses. Mom, there isn't time for that. Tim needs surgery, and they need the payment authorization today. Which hospital is he at? I'll come right over. There was a pause that lasted several seconds too long. Actually, Mom, the hospital is really limiting visitors right now. They have very strict policies about infection control, but if you could just wire the money to our account, I could handle the payment directly. Wire money to their account. No documentation, no medical bills, no way to verify that the emergency was real. Debbie, I understand that you're upset, but I'm not comfortable wiring that amount of money without seeing some paperwork first. Can you have the hospital send me the billing information directly? Mom, Debbie's voice became sharp with frustration. Tim could die while you're worrying about paperwork. The emotional manipulation was so obvious that I almost laughed. Instead, I said, then I'll meet you at the hospital right now. Which one is it? Another long pause. You know what, Mom? Never mind. I'll figure something else out. and she hung up on me. I immediately called Sarah Chen. Sarah, I think they just tried to run a scam on me. Fake medical, emergency, request for $30,000, refusal to let me visit the hospital or see any documentation. That's exactly the kind of manufactured crisis I was expecting. Mrs. Patterson, I think you need to be prepared for the possibility that they're going to escalate this to legal action very soon. What should I do? Document everything. Keep records of every conversation, every request, every interaction. And Mrs. Patterson, don't trust anything they tell you from this point forward. If they say there's an emergency, verify it independently. If they claim you've forgotten something, check your own records. They're not your family anymore. They're adversaries in a legal battle. The words hurt, but I knew she was right. 2 weeks later, I received a phone call that confirmed my worst fears. Mrs. Patterson, this is Dr. Marcus Webb from the Riverside Neurological Institute. Your daughter has scheduled a comprehensive cognitive evaluation for you tomorrow at 2 o'clock. I had never heard of Dr. Webb or the Riverside Neurological Institute, and I certainly hadn't scheduled any kind of evaluation. I'm sorry, Dr. Webb, but there must be some mistake. I didn't schedule any evaluation. According to my records, your daughter Debbie scheduled this assessment because of concerns about your cognitive function. She indicated that you might not remember making the appointment, which is actually quite common in cases of early-stage dementia. The setup was so blatant that I was almost impressed by their audacity. They were creating a situation where my denial of the appointment would be used as evidence of my supposed confusion. Dr. Webb, I need to clarify something. I have not authorized my daughter to schedule medical appointments for me, and I have no intention of attending this evaluation. If you have concerns about my competency, I suggest you review the comprehensive assessment I completed with Dr. Rachel Hendricks 3 weeks ago. Mrs. Patterson, your daughter has expressed serious concerns about your well-being. She's indicated that you've been resistant to accepting help and that your judgment may be compromised. Dr. Webb, let me be very clear. My judgment is fine, my memory is excellent, and I am perfectly capable of managing my own medical care. If my daughter wants me to have an evaluation, she can discuss it with me directly instead of making appointments behind my back. I hung up and immediately called Dave Morrison. Dave, they're trying to get me evaluated by a doctor I've never heard of, someone they chose without my knowledge or consent. This feels like the beginning of a competency challenge. Audrey, I think you're right. We need to be proactive about this. I'm going to file a preemptive motion with the court, asking for a protective order that would prevent them from taking any legal action regarding your competency without proper notice and due process. But it was too late. The next morning, I received a court summons that made my blood run cold. Debbie and Tim had filed a petition seeking emergency guardianship and conservatorship, claiming that I was suffering from dementia and was in immediate danger of financial exploitation by unknown third parties. The petition requested that the court grant them temporary authority over my finances pending a full competency hearing. The document was filled with lies so elaborate and detailed that they must have spent weeks crafting them. According to the petition, I had been paying bills multiple times, making irrational purchases, forgetting important conversations with family members, and showing signs of paranoia and confusion. The petition claimed that I had recently been approached by scam artists trying to get me to invest in fraudulent schemes, and that my family was concerned I would lose my life savings if immediate protective action wasn't taken. But the most devastating part of the petition was a sworn statement from Debbie describing my rapidly deteriorating condition and her desperate attempts to get me appropriate medical care. According to her statement, I had become hostile and suspicious, refusing to accept help from family members and making accusations about their motives. She claimed that I had forgotten basic information like my own address and phone number, and that I had shown up at non-existent appointments because of confusion about my schedule. Every single word was a lie, but it was presented with such detail and apparent sincerity that anyone reading it would naturally assume it was true. The emergency hearing was scheduled for 2 days later, 2 days to prepare for what was essentially a trial about my mental competency, with my own daughter serving as the primary witness against me. Dave Morrison immediately filed a response to the petition, including Dr. Hendricks's cognitive assessment and a detailed rebuttal of every claim Debbie and Tim had made. He also filed a motion requesting that the court order an independent evaluation of my competency rather than relying solely on family testimony, but I knew that the legal response, while necessary, wouldn't be enough. I needed to be prepared to defend myself personally, to demonstrate my competency through my own words and actions. Sarah Chen had been monitoring Debbie and Tim's activities, and she provided crucial information about their strategy. Mrs. Patterson, they're planning to bring witnesses who will testify about your supposed confusion and forgetfulness. Some of these people may genuinely believe what they're saying because Debbie and Tim have been spreading stories about your condition for weeks. What kinds of stories? They've been telling people that you've been having memory problems, getting lost while driving, forgetting to pay bills, that sort of thing. They've created a narrative about your decline, and they've been sharing it with anyone who will listen. The scope of their deception was breathtaking. They hadn't just been gaslighting me. They had been systematically destroying my reputation in the community, creating a foundation of supposed evidence that would support their legal claims. But I had one significant advantage they didn't know about. Over the past month, I had been documenting everything. Every conversation, every interaction, every attempt to manipulate or confuse me. I'd been recording phone calls, saving text messages, and keeping detailed written records of their behavior. Sarah had advised me to treat every interaction as potential evidence, and I had followed her advice meticulously. The night before the hearing, I sat in my kitchen reviewing my documentation and preparing for what might be the most important performance of my life. I would have to demonstrate my competency not just through medical evaluations and legal documents, but through my own testimony. My ability to answer questions clearly and logically. My demonstration of sound judgment and reasoning. But I also knew that this hearing was about more than just my competency. It was about power, control, and money. It was about whether Debbie and Tim would be able to steal my life savings and my independence, or whether I would be able to preserve both my dignity and my autonomy. The morning of the hearing, I dressed carefully in a conservative blue suit that conveyed both professionalism and respectability. I arrived at the courthouse early, accompanied by Dave Morrison, and armed with a briefcase full of documentation that would support my case. The courtroom was smaller than I had expected, with fluorescent lighting that gave everything a harsh, institutional feel. Debbie and Tim sat with their attorney, a sharp-looking woman in her 40s who had obviously specialized in these kinds of cases. I noticed that they had brought several witnesses, people I recognized from the neighborhood and the community, who would presumably testify about my supposed confusion and decline. Judge Patricia Walsh entered the courtroom with the kind of brisk efficiency that suggested she had presided over hundreds of similar cases. She was a woman in her early 60s with gray hair and penetrating eyes that seemed to assess everyone in the room simultaneously. "This is a petition for emergency guardianship and conservatorship," Judge Walsh announced. "The petitioners claim that Mrs. Audrey Patterson is no longer competent to manage her own affairs and requires immediate protection. Mrs. Patterson disputes these claims and maintains that she is fully competent." Debbie and Tim's attorney, Ms. Jennifer Rodriguez, made her opening statement with the kind of smooth professionalism that I immediately recognized as dangerous. "Your Honor, Mrs. Patterson is a vulnerable, elderly woman whose cognitive abilities have declined significantly over the past year. Her family has tried repeatedly to help her, but she has become paranoid and resistant to assistance. She is in immediate danger of losing her life savings to scam artists and fraudulent schemes, and she needs court protection to prevent financial catastrophe." Then Debbie took the witness stand, and I watched my own daughter weave a story about my supposed decline that was both heartbreaking and incompletely fabricated. "Your Honor," Debbie said, her voice trembling with apparent emotion, "it breaks my heart to be here today. My mother was always such a strong, independent woman. But over the past year, I've watched her change in ways that are frightening. She described incidents that had never happened, conversations that had never taken place, behaviors that existed only in her imagination. According to Debbie's testimony, I had become confused about basic daily tasks, forgotten important family events, and made irrational financial decisions that put my security at risk. Just last week, Debbie said, she called me at 3 a.m. because she couldn't remember where she was. When I went to check on her, she was in her own bedroom, but she was convinced she was in a hotel. The lie was so specific and detailed that I could see Judge Walsh taking notes, but it had never happened. I had excellent sleep patterns and had never called anyone in the middle of the night for any reason. She's also been having trouble with her finances, Debbie continued. She paid her electric bill 3 times last month because she kept forgetting that she had already paid it. And she's been talking about making large investments in companies that don't exist. Another complete fabrication. My bill-paying system hadn't changed in decades, and I had never discussed any kind of investments with Debbie. But the most devastating part of Debbie's testimony was her description of my supposed paranoia and hostility. "She's become suspicious of everyone, including her own family," Debbie said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "She accuses us of trying to steal from her, even though all we want to do is help." She refuses to let us assist with anything, and she gets angry when we express concern about her well-being. It was a masterful performance, combining just enough truth to be believable with lies that painted me as a confused, paranoid old woman who needed protection from her own poor judgment. Tim's testimony was equally damaging. He described incidents of confusion, forgetfulness, and irrational behavior that had never occurred. He spoke about my supposed inability to remember recent conversations, my confusion about dates and appointments, and my resistance to accepting help with basic daily tasks. She's become increasingly agitated and defensive, Tim continued, his voice filled with practiced concern. Last month, she accused me of moving things around her house when I was simply trying to help her organize. She seems to believe that everyone is plotting against her, which is a classic sign of paranoid dementia. I sat listening to this elaborate fiction, forcing myself to remain calm and composed while my own family systematically destroyed my reputation and credibility. But I had been preparing for this moment, and I knew that my response would be crucial. Their attorney called several witnesses from the community, people who testified about conversations they had supposedly had with Debbie and Tim about my declining condition. Agnes, my neighbor, was called to testify, and I held my breath as she took the stand. Mrs. Henderson, Ms. Rodriguez said, have you observed any changes in Mrs. Patterson's behavior over the past year? Agnes looked directly at me, then back at the attorney. I've known Audrey Patterson for 15 years, she said firmly. She is one of the sharpest, most capable women I've ever met. She manages her household, her finances, and her affairs better than most people half her age. I have never observed any confusion, forgetfulness, or cognitive decline. I could see Debbie and Tim exchange worried glances. Agnes was supposed to support their narrative, not contradict it. But Mrs. Henderson was, Ms. Rodriguez pressed. Didn't you tell Mrs. Patterson's son-in-laws that you had concerns about her mental state? Absolutely not, Agnes replied firmly. Tim Patterson approached me several weeks ago asking leading questions about Audrey's behavior. When I told him that she was perfectly fine, he seemed disappointed. I found his questions inappropriate and intrusive. The attorney quickly dismissed Agnes and called their next witness, but the damage had been done. Agnes had established that Tim had been actively soliciting negative testimony about my mental state, which supported the defense we were planning to present. Several other witnesses followed, but their testimony was less compelling than Debbie and Tim had obviously hoped. Most could only repeat secondhand information they had received from my daughter and son-in-law, and none had personally observed the concerning behaviors that were supposedly evidence of my decline. When it was time for our defense, Dave Morrison stood with the confidence of someone who had been preparing for this moment for weeks. Your Honor, Dave began, Mrs. Patterson is not a confused, declining, elderly woman who needs protection from her own judgment. She's a sharp, capable individual who has become the target of a systematic campaign of financial elder abuse perpetrated by her own family members. Dave presented Dr. Hendrix's cognitive assessment, the psychiatric evaluation I had undergone with Dr. Sarah Chen at his recommendation, and documentation of my financial management over the past year. Every piece of evidence demonstrated not just competency, but above-average cognitive function for someone my age. But the most powerful moment came when Dave called Sarah Chen to testify about her investigation into Debbie and Tim's financial situation and their systematic campaign to undermine my credibility. Sarah took the stand with the professional demeanor of someone who had testified in hundreds of similar cases. She methodically presented evidence of Debbie and Tim's crushing debt, their consultations with guardianship attorneys, and their attempts to gather information about my financial assets. In my professional opinion, Sarah testified, this guardianship petition is not motivated by genuine concern for Mrs. Patterson's well-being. It appears to be a calculated attempt to gain control of her substantial assets in order to solve the petitioner's immediate financial problems. Sarah also presented recordings of several phone conversations in which Tim had attempted to gather information about my finances from various institutions, recordings that clearly demonstrated his knowledge that I was mentally competent. But the most damaging evidence was a recording Sarah had obtained of a conversation between Debbie and Tim discussing their strategy for the guardianship proceeding. In the recording, they explicitly discussed how to present the evidence of my supposed incompetency and how to divide my assets once they gained control. We just need to get through this hearing, Tim's voice said clearly through the courtroom speakers. Once we have guardianship, we can sell the house, liquidate the investments, and pay off our debts. She'll never know what hit her. The courtroom fell completely silent. Debbie had gone pale, and Tim looked like he might be physically ill. Finally, it was my turn to testify. I took the witness stand with 71 years of life experience behind me and the knowledge that this testimony would determine whether I retained my independence and dignity or lost both to my own family's greed. Dave's questions were straightforward and designed to demonstrate my competency through my own words and reasoning. Mrs. Patterson, can you tell the court about your current living situation and how you manage your daily affairs? I described my routine in detail, explaining how I managed my household, my finances, my medical care, and my social activities. I spoke clearly and logically, providing specific examples and dates that demonstrated both my memory and my judgment. Mrs. Patterson, the petitioners have claimed that you've been paying bills multiple times and making poor financial decisions. Can you address those allegations? I pulled out my detailed financial records showing Judge Walsh my systematic approach to bill paying, my careful tracking of expenses, and my conservative investment strategy. I explained how my financial advisor had commended my management of my portfolio and how my bank had never raised any concerns about my account activity. Mrs. Patterson, how do you respond to the claims that you've been confused about appointments and conversations with family members? This was the moment I had been preparing for. I pulled out my detailed calendar and my documentation of every interaction with Debbie and Tim over the past 6 months. Your Honor, Schatz, I said, I keep detailed records of my appointments, conversations, and activities. I can demonstrate that many of the incidents my daughter has described simply never happened. For example, she testified that I called her at 3 a.m. last week because I was confused about where I was. According to my phone records, which I have here, I made no calls to anyone between the hours of 10 p.m. and 8 a.m. on any day last week. I presented my documentation systematically, refuting each claim with specific evidence. Phone records that contradicted their claims about confused late-night calls. Bank records that showed I had never paid any bill multiple times. Medical records that demonstrated my excellent cognitive function. But the most powerful moment came when Dave asked me directly about my daughter's motivations. Mrs. Patterson, why do you believe your daughter has filed this petition? I looked directly at Debbie, seeing in her face the child I had raised and loved, but also seeing the woman who had chosen greed over family loyalty. Your Honor, I said, I believe my daughter and son-in-law are facing serious financial difficulties, and they see my assets as the solution to their problems. Rather than asking for help honestly or working to solve their debt problems themselves, they have chosen to try to take control of my money by portraying me as incompetent. It's painful to acknowledge, but the evidence clearly supports this conclusion. Ms. Rodriguez's cross-examination was aggressive but ineffective. She tried to portray my documentation as obsessive behavior, my clarity as rehearsed responses, and my allegations about Debbie and Tim's motivations as paranoid delusions. But every attack only served to demonstrate my mental acuity and my ability to respond logically under pressure. When the testimony concluded, Judge Walsh called a brief recess. When she returned, her decision was swift and decisive. I have reviewed all the evidence presented in this matter, Judge Walsh began, and I find that the petitioners have failed to meet their burden of proving that Mrs. Patterson is incapacitated or in need of guardianship. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but the judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, I am deeply troubled by the evidence suggesting that this petition was filed not out of genuine concern for Mrs. Patterson's well-being, but as part of a scheme to gain unauthorized access to her assets. The court finds credible evidence of attempted financial elder abuse. Judge Walsh denied the guardianship petition entirely and ordered that Debbie and Tim pay my attorney fees and court costs. But more importantly, she referred the matter to the district attorney's office for potential criminal prosecution. As we left the courtroom, I heard Tim hissing at Debbie. You said this would work. You said she was too old and confused to fight back effectively. Too old and confused to fight back. There it was. Their fundamental miscalculation laid bare. They had confused age with weakness, assumed that love meant vulnerability, and believed that family loyalty was a one-way street that they could exploit without consequences. But I wasn't finished with them, not even close. Dave and I immediately filed a civil lawsuit for attempted elder financial abuse, fraud, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and defamation. We sought not just monetary damages, but also a permanent restraining order that would prevent them from ever contacting me again or making any future claims on my estate. The discovery process for the civil case revealed even more damaging evidence of their scheme. Email exchanges between Debbie and Tim discussing their strategy for gaining control of my assets, text messages in which they calculated how much money they would have access to once they became my guardians, financial records showing that they had already been planning how to spend my money before they had even gained control of it. The most shocking discovery was a life insurance policy Tim had taken out on me, without my knowledge, using information he had gathered during his investigation of my finances. The policy was for $500,000, with Tim listed as the beneficiary. When confronted with this evidence during his deposition, Tim's explanation was both pathetic and revealing. "I was just trying to protect the family's financial future, Shaz," he said. "If something happened to Audrey, we wanted to make sure there would be enough money to cover funeral expenses and settle her affairs. But the policy was far more than would be needed for funeral expenses, and Tim had no legal insurable interest that would justify such a large policy on my life." The case never went to trial. 6 months after we filed the lawsuit, Debbie and Tim's attorney approached Dave with a settlement offer. They agreed to pay a substantial monetary settlement, to accept a permanent restraining order prohibiting any contact with me, and to relinquish any future claims on my estate. They also agreed to cancel the life insurance policy Tim had taken out on me. But for me, the most satisfying part of the settlement wasn't the money. It was the requirement that they publicly acknowledge their wrongdoing. As part of the settlement agreement, they were required to send a written apology to everyone they had contacted during their campaign to undermine my reputation, explaining that their claims about my mental decline had been false, and that they had been motivated by their own financial problems rather than genuine concern for my well-being. The public humiliation was complete and permanent. In a small community like ours, that kind of acknowledgement of wrongdoing follows people for the rest of their lives. 3 years have passed since that day in the courtroom, and my life has never been better. I sold the house, not because I was forced to, but because I chose to. I bought a beautiful townhouse in an active senior community where I'm surrounded by sharp, independent people who treat me with the respect I deserve. I have new friends, new activities, and for the first time in years, genuine peace of mind. I travel when I want to, spend money on things that bring me joy, and wake up every morning knowing that I'm in control of my own destiny. I learned through mutual acquaintances that Debbie and Tim eventually filed for bankruptcy and lost their house. Tim's reputation in the real estate industry was permanently damaged by the public record of the guardianship case in the civil lawsuit. Debbie transferred to a different hospital system after word of her attempted elder abuse spread through the medical community. As for Rachel, my granddaughter, she reached out to me on her 18th birthday. Apparently, she had known nothing about her parents' scheme until she accidentally overheard a conversation between them after the court case concluded. She was horrified by what they had tried to do and wanted to rebuild our relationship. We meet for coffee now every few weeks, and I'm helping her with college expenses. She's studying nursing like her mother, but with a specialization in geriatric care. She says she wants to protect elderly patients from the kind of abuse her parents tried to perpetrate against me. "Grandma," she said during one of our recent visits, "I can't believe they thought they could get away with something so horrible." "Rachel," I told her, "people often make the mistake of assuming that age equals vulnerability. Your parents confused my love for them with weakness, and they assumed that because I'm older I wouldn't be able to defend myself effectively." "But you showed them." "I did. And I hope other families won't have to learn this lesson the hard way." I think about that conversation often because it encapsulates something important about respect, family relationships, and the assumptions people make about aging. Respect isn't something you're automatically entitled to because of your age or your role in the family. It's something you command through your actions, your boundaries, and your willingness to defend your dignity when it's threatened. My daughter and son-in-law made a fundamental error in their understanding of who I am and what I'm capable of. They saw a 71-year-old woman living alone and assumed she would be an easy target for their financial desperation. They mistook my love and trust for weakness and vulnerability. What they failed to understand is that 71 years of life experience had taught me exactly how to recognize manipulation, gather evidence, build alliances, and fight back strategically when threatened. They underestimated not just my intelligence and resources, but my determination to protect what I had worked a lifetime to build. The money they tried to steal through legal manipulation is still mine, growing steadily in investments that will fund my comfortable retirement and eventually benefit the people who actually deserve my generosity. The house they planned to sell without my consent became my choice to leave on my own terms, for my own reasons, at my own timing. The dignity they tried to strip away through lies and false testimony remains intact, probably stronger than it was before I was forced to defend it. And the family relationships they thought they could exploit and manipulate have been restructured on terms that protect my well-being rather than enabling their greed. Every morning when I wake up in my beautiful townhouse, surrounded by people who treat me with genuine respect and friendship, I'm reminded that some battles are worth fighting, even when they're painful, even when they force you to acknowledge that the people who should love and protect you were really just waiting for you to become vulnerable enough to exploit. I'm not vulnerable. I never was. The gray hair and the 71 years of age don't make me weak or confused or easy to manipulate. They make me experienced, careful, and absolutely determined to protect what's mine from people who would take advantage of me. That's a lesson Debbie and Tim learned too late, and it cost them everything they thought they were entitled to. Their greed destroyed their relationship with me, damaged their reputations permanently, and left them worse off financially than they were before they started their scheme. But it's also a lesson I hope other families can learn before they make similar mistakes. Because the next time someone assumes that age equals vulnerability, or that family loyalty is a one-way street they can exploit without consequences, I hope they remember my story. Respect your elders. We've survived this long for good reasons, and we've learned things along the way that serve us well when we're threatened. We have resources, wisdom, allies, and determination that might surprise people who make assumptions based on our age. Underestimate us at your own peril. We're not going quietly into anyone's vision of what our later years should look like, especially if that vision involves surrendering our autonomy to people who see us as obstacles rather than human beings deserving of dignity and respect. I proved that being 71 doesn't make you helpless. I proved that family doesn't get a free pass to abuse you just because they share your DNA. And I proved that sometimes the most important gift you can give yourself is the courage to fight back against people who mistake your kindness for weakness. The best revenge against people who underestimate you is to prove them spectacularly, publicly, and permanently wrong. And that's exactly what I did.